I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
I'm Howard Husock, Vice President for Policy Research at the Manhattan Institute and Director of our Philanthropy and Social Entrepreneurship Initiative. This annual lecture complements our ongoing research and awards program by bringing to the Institute leading thinkers on current policy discussions regarding the role and effectiveness of philanthropy and the independent sector. Our work is based in the belief that not just public policy, but civil society, citizens working in concert with each other, with private financial support, can have profound and beneficial effects on our society. Previous speakers in this series have included David Nassau, historian of the CUNY Graduate Center and biographer of Andrew Carnegie, William Schambra of the Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal, and last year, Clayton Christensen of the Harvard Business School. To introduce this year's Simon Lecturer, Matthew Bishop of The Economist, it's my pleasure to turn to the president of the William E. Simon Foundation, James Piereson.
Thanks very much, Howard. On behalf of the Manhattan, welcome. Thank you to Matthew Bishop for agreeing to deliver this year's Simon Lecture. This is an especially appropriate time to reflect on the role and contributions of major philanthropists, especially the kind whom our speaker tonight has termed Philanthrocapitalists. I refer not only to the spirit of holiday charity, which is certainly important. In addition, next year, 2013, marks the centennial of the founding of a trailblazing American philanthropic institution, the Rockefeller Foundation. John D. Rockefeller, along with Andrew Carnegie, are responsible in one way or another for several of New York City's landmark institutions: Carnegie Hall, Rockefeller University, Rockefeller Center, the New York Public Library, Riverside Church, just to mention a few. But they did more. Especially, they invented and inspired the kind of philanthropy that Mr. Bishop describes in his book, Philanthrocapitalism, How Giving Can Save the World, paperback edition. The Rockefeller Foundation especially pioneered the idea that philanthropy can transcend charity by attacking the causes and not just the symptoms of social ills. Philanthropy, in other words, can be an instrument for reform and progress if intelligently and scientifically applied. This revolutionary idea, in the hands of Rockefeller and his advisors at the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, later Rockefeller University, yielded several historic and far-reaching breakthroughs: the elimination of hookworm disease across the South, advancing the public health movement in the 1920s and 1930s, and the Green Revolution in the post-war era that vastly increased the productivity of agriculture in the developing world, and thereby helped to eliminate the scourge of widespread hunger. William E. Simon, Bill Simon, the man for whom this lecture is named, believes strongly in the mission for philanthropy set forth by Rockefeller and Carnegie. He certainly believed philanthropy can be a force for good, a more innovative and flexible an approach than government can ever be. And he organized his own philanthropy around the biblical admonition: give a man a fish and he will eat for a day. Teach him how to fish and he will eat for a lifetime. Bill Simon also knew that it is the capitalist system and the wealth it generates that makes philanthropy possible in the first place. And thus it is especially appropriate that Mr. Bishop links these two concepts in the title of his book. In Philanthrocapitalism, Matthew Bishop tells the stories of the latter-day Rockefellers, men and women like Bill Gates, Oprah Winfrey, Warren Buffett, Bob Buford, Michael Bloomberg, Sir John Templeton, and many others. Their contributions to New York City, our nation, and indeed the world are impossible to measure, and they will go on. But in the wake of the financial crisis, we are now hearing some of the same criticisms of philanthropy that were loudly voiced a century ago when the charter for the Rockefeller Foundation was first granted. Philanthropy, some say, and still say, and said then, is just public relations, a cynical strategy to gloss over inequality, burnish the reputations of the wealthy. The long-lasting benefits of Rockefeller's work are sufficient to dismantle such claims, and that is also true of many of his successors today. Nevertheless, the criticisms are still out there and are widely believed as indictments of both philanthropy and the free market capitalist system. It is in this context in which our speaker tonight returns to the theme of philanthropy and its justification, 4 years after the original publication of his path-breaking book. Matthew Bishop is U.S. business editor and New York bureau chief of The Economist. In addition to Philanthrocapitalism, written with Michael Green, he is also the co-author with Mr. Green of In Gold We Trust, The Future of Money in an Age of Uncertainty, and The Road from Ruin, 2010, also with Mr. Green, on capitalism in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg has called Philanthrocapitalism, available now in its paperback edition, quote, the definitive guide to a new generation of philanthropists who understand innovation and risk-taking and who will play a crucial role in solving the biggest problems facing the world today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Simon lecturer, Matthew Bishop. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that warm introduction. And for those of you that want copies of the paperback edition of the book, I do have a few with me that will be available on sale afterwards, but I'm happy to sign them as well if you'd like that. I have a particular pleasure in being here to deliver this lecture because Roger Hertog, who has been a great funder and supporter of the Manhattan Institute over the years, has some responsibility for the writing of Philanthrocapitalism, because I wrote an earlier special report for The Economist called The Business of Giving, and I got this phone call from Roger saying, you should write a book. It was a very brief call. I think he does brief calls, but it was to the point. And whether he likes the book that came out of it or not, I still to find out, but I wrote it anyway, and I'm grateful to him for the encouragement. So one of the strangest interviews I ever did was with Ted Turner, founder of CNN, ex-husband of Hanoi Jane, and billion-dollar philanthropist. And we spoke in his apartment at the Waldorf Hotel about this billion-dollar gift that he had promised to the United Nations in 1997 and eventually sort of given them. And a promise made apparently on a whim because he hadn't got anything controversial enough in his speech that he was giving that evening. And I asked him, sitting perched on this chaise longue, his latest girlfriend to my right and with 3 or 4 PR girls looking on, I looked at Ted and he was rocking backwards and forwards on his chair, easily distracted, becoming quite hard of hearing. And I asked him, so what impact do you think your $1 billion gift to the United Nations has had? And there was this long silence and he stared at me intently. And then finally he said, do you know, if you wore a hairpiece, you'd look 10 years younger. And I almost fell off the chaise longue. I think the girlfriend maybe did. And he then continued, if I had my way, I would ban men from holding any public office for the next 100 years. And then finally returned to my question, saying, well, you want to think you made a positive difference. I don't know what this says, really, in terms of except that they're a very rum bunch, some of these philanthrocapitalists. And I won't try to debate here whether or not the UN is in better shape now than it was before Turner got out his checkbook. You know, what is clear, I think, is that his gift has made a difference of sorts to the UN. There is now a lot more private sector involvement there. When he tried to give money to the UN, he was told it was illegal to do so as a private citizen. And this led to the creation of the UN Office for Partnerships, which has never been busier, striking out deals with philanthrocapitalists, not-for-profits and big business, for better or for worse. But the biggest difference that Turner's gift made was that it helped to kickstart a movement of highly public giving by the wealthy of America and increasingly the wealthy of the world. So this is the movement I call Philanthrocapitalism. I christened it that in the Economist article back in 2006, which Roger Hertog read and led to him suggesting I wrote the book. And then we wrote about in the book Philanthrocapitalism, how giving can save the world. And in his UN speech, Turner challenged his fellow super rich to become serious philanthropists, and then went on to name names about those tycoons he thought were, quotes, awash in money they don't know what to do with, and who should start giving it away. And these guilty men included Bill Gates. And this movement achieved, in my view, critical mass in June 2006 in the New York Public Library, when Warren Buffett called Bill Gates onto the stage, handed him an IOU for most of his fortune, which was then around $30 billion, and asked him to give it away through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, this was a truly unique moment in human history, and I was amazed to be there that day watching it and realizing I was at a unique moment. Never before had the two most successful business people of any age stood together on stage promising to give away the vast part of their wealth to fight poverty and disease among the poorest people on the planet, and in this case to improve America's failing school system. In its visibility and scale, this took the American tradition of mega philanthropy, which Jim referred to, which sort of marks its 100th anniversary with the Rockefeller Foundation's birthday next year, which had flourished in the early decades of the 20th century. It took this to a new level, from which it's continued to rise, in my view, with the launch by Buffett and Gates in 2010 of the Giving Pledge. And so far, 93 American billionaires have taken the pledge, publicly promising to give away at least half of their fortunes by the time they die. According to Forbes, there are now 425 American billionaires out of a global total of 1,225, so maybe we still have over 330 more pledges to come. Let's hope so. Now, I know there's a long spiritual tradition that sanctifies giving in secret, primarily with the excellent goal of discouraging excessive pride and self-aggrandizement by the giver. Yet I think this growing movement to pledge publicly is necessary for reasons of transparency and accountability, a theme I'm going to return to later. Now, the list of pledges includes even some 20-somethings, most notably Mark Zuckerberg, the co-founder of Facebook. In his Devil's Dictionary, the satirist Ambrose Bierce defined a philanthropist as a rich and usually bald old gentleman who has trained himself to grin while his conscience is picking his pocket. Well, today philanthropy is no longer just an old man's game. We can look forward to half a century or more of giving from some of the new generation of philanthrocapitalists, which at least gives them plenty of time to learn to do it right, something which many of them will take most of that 50 years to do, I would suspect. The movement is also going global, as the new wealthy of other developed economies, and increasingly the emerging economies, embrace philanthropy, albeit often tailored to the local circumstances and cultural traditions. In the past 12 months, I've spoken to new philanthropists in China, India, Britain, and even Sweden, the traditional home of statism. Now, as to local conditions, when Warren Buffett and Bill Gates turned up in China and India to talk about the Giving Pledge, more philanthropists seemed to be fleeing than sitting down to eat with them, because I think they felt their cultural traditions wouldn't really welcome that. And it's been interesting to see that there's been a much more nuanced discussion in both countries between Gates and Buffett privately since those initial visits, which in India has been really about focusing on showing the Indian tycoons that there are opportunities to really make a difference because there are well enough run organizations for them to invest in. And in China, I think a much greater recognition of the sensitivity of very visible giving at a time when government is still very slowly coming to terms with the private sector taking the lead on dealing with any social issues. But nonetheless, this is a global movement. And some of my favourite philanthrocapitalists are from the developing world, none more so than Mo Ibrahim, whose cell phone business made him the first homegrown African billionaire entrepreneur. Now, he's established a huge prize for recently retired heads of government in Africa, about $3.5 million plus $750,000 a year for the rest of their lives. And the goal of this is to encourage a proper debate about governance in Africa and to reward those leaders who did a good job in office. And I think maybe the most powerful message that's been sent by this prize has been that it hasn't been awarded in 3 of the 6 years for which it's been up for grabs, because there was no candidate good enough. And this has stimulated a really important conversation across Africa, supported by a growing amount of evidence about comparative analysis of government and society in different countries. Now, this rise of philanthropy around the world, in my view, is entirely unsurprising. From our study of history, Michael Green and I found that periods of great entrepreneurial wealth creation, wherever in the world they occur, seem always to give rise to great philanthropy, often philanthropy heavily influenced and shaped by the business thinking that drove the wealth creation. So if you went back to the first golden age, and we're, I think, in the 5th golden age of philanthropy since modern capitalism was born out of medieval Europe. If you went back to the first 3, they were in Europe. The first really was merchant traders for the first time setting up schools and hospitals, often in areas where the church had neglected them. And very much as time went on, you then had the second golden age around the formation of the public stock, joint stock company, where philanthropy imitated in many ways the process of creating a business, where the social entrepreneurs of the day would go out and raise subscriptions from a series of donors who would then have voting rights and the ability to actually fire the manager of the non-profit, a system that I believe we would do well to replicate today. But as time went on, today's era is very much an era of global capitalism, and I think we increasingly see a globalized philanthropy operating on a scale that we haven't seen before, using business techniques and strategies that we haven't seen before applied to philanthropy. Just as in a way, the Rockefellers and Carnegies created institutions on a scale and set about institution building in a way that very much reflected the first era in which capitalism had moved to huge industrial concerns, building on massive economies of scale. Now, the original subtitle of our book, Philanthrocapitalism, was not how giving can save the world, but how the rich can save the world. And Michael Green and I stand by both of those subtitles. So why the new subtitle? Well, candidly, we learnt the hard way by launching the book a week after Lehman Brothers collapsed. In that economic climate, and I think that continues to this day, saying anything positive about the rich is no way to sell books. And we do think that the message of philanthrocapitalism is important and deserves to be widely read. Philanthropy, in our view, can play a crucial role in tackling the biggest problems facing the world. And I think one of the reasons that it can do so is because, compared to almost all other sources of money in society, philanthropic capital is free capital. Free not just because it tends not to require any economic payback for its use, but free because it's able to do pretty much as it likes with very few constraints. That means it can take risks, back unpopular causes, challenge conventional wisdom, be contrarian, things that I believe our society needs more than ever if it's to solve some of the big problems that we face. My current favourite example of this free spirit is Peter Thiel, the German libertarian co-founder of PayPal, whose philanthropy has supported causes ranging from encouraging kids with bright ideas to quit college and start a business, to seasteading, which is building these sort of floating offshore communities where they can experiment with all sorts of different political systems, to even trying to reverse biological aging. This is contrarianism and speculative and long-term experimentation writ large. In our book, Michael Green and I argue that giving by the rich has the potential to have more impact than giving by ordinary people, because the rich can be, quotes, hyper-agents. As we write in the book, they do not face elections every few years like politicians, or suffer the tyranny of shareholders' demands for ever-increasing quarterly profits like the CEOs of most public companies, nor do they have to devote vast amounts of time and resources to raising money like most heads of NGOs. That frees them to think long-term, to go against conventional wisdom, to take up ideas too risky for government, to deploy substantial resources quickly when the situation demands it, and above all, to try something new. Now, let me make 3 comments about hyperagency. First, new social media through low-cost connectivity, the generation of big data and analytics of that big data, and the creation of ubiquitous feedback loops is dramatically increasing the ability of ordinary givers to practice collective or crowd hyperagency. I saw this at first hand last month as an advisor to the Giving Tuesday campaign, which with very little money and a lot of social media activity has produced a significant increase in online giving in America on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving this year. It's a small example, but I think the power of social media is going to become far greater over the next few years, not least by giving a long overdue voice to the people the giving is intended to benefit, people who are often ignored and actually not all that much benefited by the good intentions of the giver. Second, public companies also have the potential for philanthrocapitalistic hyperagency, but are often held back by market pressures to maximize short-term profits. I'm not talking here about abandoning the profit motive or anything of that kind, but many bosses that I speak to believe that they could do what Michael Porter calls create shared value by investing in things that benefit simultaneously society and the bottom line. But that many of these initiatives require long-term perspective and maybe taking a hit to the bottom line in the short run. And so they're unable to pursue these strategies to the degree that they would like, because the stock market punishes that kind of short-term hit. And I'm closely watching Unilever, which is trying to defy this conventional wisdom, having set out to double its sales by 2020, primarily in the developing world, whilst halving its environmental footprint. Probably as bold and objective as any company has set itself in terms of simultaneously benefiting the planet and its profits. I'm struck too by recent developments in private equity, which is obviously less fixated on short-term profits than public companies are. And as an illustration of what might happen if public companies were encouraged to take a longer-term view, look no further than private equity firm of Kohlberg, Kravis and Roberts, who obviously we all remember from their 1980s heydays as the barbarians at the gate. And you may not have heard of their more recent activities, such as a flourishing partnership with the Environmental Defence Fund, which gets full access to all the companies in the KKR portfolio and is invited to propose ways in which to make them more sustainable, and to publicly criticise KKR if these ideas aren't taken up. Over the long term, KKR reckons this green portfolio program will add significantly to its profits. At the end of last year, it reported cost savings since starting in 2008 of $365 million, and said it had avoided 810,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions, 2.2 million tons of waste, and 300 million litres of water. Now, I'm aware of the Manhattan Institute's criticisms of shareholder activists, particularly from trade union-run pension funds. However, I do think we need institutional shareholders to become more engaged as long-term owners of public companies, not less, as I think the Institute seems to want. If we are to reduce bad short-term pressures on companies and allow them to pursue long-term goals in their enlightened self-interest. And I actually gave a lecture last week at the Mansion House in the City of London about how to make finance more socially useful, one of which focuses was on this question of how do we reconnect ourselves with how our savings are invested, so that we don't just write a check each month to our 401k fund, or our company puts it in our pension fund and then that's the last we think of it, but actually we help to ensure that the institutions that are intermediaries who are acting as owners on our behalf actually do properly steward our money. And in Britain, I think the idea has certainly caught on that many of our public companies are in effect ownerless corporations who are really maybe some of the least accountable forces out there in society, and that actually we need to really focus on the institutional shareholders and figure out how to make them more accountable to us. And this seems to be a challenge that some philanthrocapitalists are increasingly interested in taking up, as I will explain in a moment. Anyway, third, the hyper-agency of the rich is significant but not overwhelming. Compared with the modern state, or indeed big business, their giving is relatively small and needs to be done cleverly if it is to make a real difference. And I remember Bill Gates responding to my asking if his foundation, which was by then giving away an unprecedented $3 billion a year, was becoming a big, all-powerful monster like Microsoft, which he answered, "We're a tiny, tiny organization." And then he pointed out that that $3 billion was about a fifth of the annual schools budget in New York City, which very quickly puts in perspective the scale of the challenge. Equally, though, if one looks at the impact of venture capital, which has created many companies worth hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, we can see that the amount of money is not necessarily a key indicator. It's how that money is used, and if it can be directed where it can make a real difference, then ultimately its impact can be huge. Now, Gates was very, very clear that even with his connections, which are another enormous asset that the rich tend to have that helps them be hyper-agents, his money would not be enough to move the needle in tackling the world's biggest problems unless he could convince others, many others, to partner with him in pursuing his goals. Without partners, including ultimately a significant part of the public through their political consent, it would not be possible for Gates to achieve his goals. That's why one of the favorite words of philanthrocapitalists is from the finance industry, it's leverage. And you hear it all the time. They want to maximize the bang for their buck by leveraging the resources of others, whether they're in the non-profit sector, in business, or in government. And it's striking to me that as you talk to philanthropists, the longer they're doing it, the more they think about leverage, the more they think in terms of where do we find the tipping point in the system where a little bit of money would make a huge difference, or the bottleneck where if you could unblock something, it would have a huge consequence. And Gates himself, when I first interviewed him about this back in 2001, was very much of the view, I just invent the vaccines and somehow the vaccines will find their way to the people who need them. And he has a very much more complicated and nuanced view of that now. So there is growing concern, firstly, about how do you leverage the non-profit sector. And one way that clearly happened very quickly was the language changed, that you had a focus on philanthropists becoming social investors, charities becoming social entrepreneurs, a language that was around impact and scale quickly coming in where it maybe previously had been much more anecdotal, much less rigorous. The best philanthrocapitalists, in my view, when they have a relationship with a non-profit, they're very much thinking about it in the same way that a venture capitalist would think about a startup. They're not thinking about how do we skimp on costs, but how do we build capacity that will allow this organization to grow big and successful if it succeeds. Increasingly, people are thinking about what the capital curve for a non-profit should look like that would allow it to scale up. You know, when do you have to give it seed capital? What does that look like? What kind of mentoring do you need? How do you get through the $10 million ceiling, which tends to have been a huge problem for many non-profits that sort of stabilize there? How do you avoid going down the route of becoming an anecdote popular at lots of conferences, but actually never getting below beyond the first sort of charming picture to really making a difference. There's some real culture clashes that often occur when these philanthrocapitalists first go to the non-profits, and the non-profits don't like them and they don't really respect each other, and that's obviously something that a lot of work is required on. And there's also been, I think, a lot of interesting debate about the role of metrics and how do you measure the performance of a non-profit, and do you set appropriate goals that actually help the non-profit achieve its mission, or do you actually create lots of data that just bogs people down in bureaucracy or gets them to focus on the wrong goals? And I think there's just a fascinating conversation going on now that's getting to actually put these proper language, the proper rules in place, the proper ground rules, so that we actually can have a productive partnership between the person who's bringing a business mindset and business money to the non-profit world and the people he's trying to help. There's also growing interest among philanthrocapitalists in leveraging capitalism itself by developing market mechanisms to address poverty and harnessing for-profit capital to grow these solutions to a scale that charity alone could never reach. And one organization to watch here is the Omidyar network, created by Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, who famously has a bust of Adam Smith on his desk and has a very market-orientated view of the world. A few years ago, he had a run-in with Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize winning founder of Grameen Bank, over whether microfinance should ever be run for profit. And he believed that essentially this service of microcredit would never be provided by charity on a scale that it could be provided on by the for-profit motive being harnessed, and basically set up a large fund that proved that this was the case. It's been interesting that it did achieve massive scale, but it also had some very sad consequences in terms of bad lending practices, leading to some Indian farmers being over-indebted and committing suicide, which I think has been a very instructive lesson to anyone interested in that whole area, because it seems that there wasn't enough investment in dealing with rather predictable problems of what happens when you start suddenly pumping credit into a market where no one's really had any access to it before, without having proper regulatory instruments in place like a credit bureau or anything of that kind. And now Omidyar, I think, is bringing a much more nuanced approach to its giving, where it's simultaneously looking at how do you build a whole marketplace up, what do you put in place as an ecosystem, as well as how do you create the right business models. And this is clearly a job where philanthropy has to play an important early role in testing out what works and what doesn't work. The Omidyar network now funds a wide range of organizations, from Hernando de Soto's Institute for Liberty and Democracy, which is all about promoting property rights for the poor, to Bridge International Academies, a company that delivers high-quality education at the base of the pyramid in Kenya. This is very different from traditional philanthropy. The new buzz phrase for all this is impact investing, an idea pushed by philanthrocapitalists who want their for-profit investments to help drive forward their philanthropic mission as well as their grant making. Now, so far, to be frank, there's been more talk about this than action. My favorite example is the Rockefeller Foundation here, which funded a lot of the development of the impact investing language through its grants, but so far hasn't invested any of its endowment in any impact investments, which I think shows you a lot of the problems with traditional structures of foundations besides anything else. JP Morgan believes that by 2020, impact investing could be so large an asset class that it would be worth anything between $400 billion and $1 trillion, and would attract mainstream investors as well as philanthropists. Now, perhaps the most interesting new impact investing product is the social impact bond, or as it is known here, the pay for success bond. This tries to leverage both government and private capital to scale up a non-profit. The bond is sold to for-profit investors whose money is used to scale up the non-profit, which has an idea that can reduce government spending over the long term. In the recent pioneering social impact bond issue in New York, This is the non-profit was the Adolescent Behavioral Learning Experience program for teens jailed on Rikers Island. The aim of this program was to reduce reoffending, which obviously significantly benefits government spending in the long run if you have far fewer people in jail. So if the program succeeds, investors will be paid a good profit by the government out of the savings that have been made from fewer jailings. On the other hand, if things go wrong, the private sector takes the hit, not the government. And this is clearly potentially going to solve one of the big problems of government, which is it tends to be terribly risk-averse when it comes to investing in very obvious precautionary programs that don't really pay off for several years. The social impact bond in this case is backed by Goldman Sachs and the Bloomberg Foundation, the charitable arm of a mayor who I suspect likes to view his entire political career as an act of philanthropy. Michael Bloomberg has pioneered what I believe may be a model for how philanthropy can drive innovation in the public sector by getting philanthropists to back pilots of risky policy experiments, which, if successful, can be easily incorporated into the public budget and scaled up because they are now proven to work. One of the first examples of this was the Academy for Training Principals for schools in New York, which was modelled on the Jack Welch Training Centre at Crotonville, which trained GE managers. And the cost was about $150,000 a head per principal, which it was concluded would be very hard to sell to the public in New York as a use of their taxpayers' money. So it was initially funded by Eli Broad, but once it was shown that the principals actually had a much better track record than untrained principals, it became relatively straightforward to transfer that budget into the city budget and scale it up. I think there's also the potential for government to make use of incentive prizes like the X Prize to stimulate private action, and maybe philanthropists could pay those prizes, or for matching grants whereby policies will only go ahead, public money will only be spent if a sufficient number of private individuals are willing to put up some matching funds to say, we think this has been market tested and we think this works. However, on the other hand, we need to be careful that the private-public partnerships that result really are benefiting the public rather than the private individuals involved. Now, the goal of leveraging government is increasingly widespread among philanthrocapitalists from Gates down, which in turn is giving rise to growing controversy. Philanthrocapitalists cover most of the political waterfront, though compared with the population at large, they tend to be far more pro-capitalistic for obvious reasons. The more partisan philanthrocapitalists, whether it be George Soros on the left or the Koch brothers on the right, have obviously become favourite bogeymen for the foot soldiers on the other side. Two quick points here. One is that I broadly welcome the pluralism that this brings. Whilst both sides have their hyper agents battling away at each other, though I would like to see a lot more transparency about this, I think ultimately their money shouldn't do too much damage to democracy and may, in surprising ways, actually enliven our democracy. Second, though, I do worry a bit that some of these clashing titans are reducing their potential impact by becoming too narrowly partisan. Some of the most effective philanthropy in the second half of the 20th century was in the battle of ideas, such as when conservative foundations backed the development of a new market-friendly intellectual consensus that made possible the governments of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and to a lesser degree of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. Here, William E. Simon himself played a crucial role, not least as president of the Olin Foundation, which gave grants to think tanks such as the American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institute, and, of course, the Manhattan Institute, and also supported the work of scholars like Alan Bloom, Samuel Huntington, and Irving Kristol. Now, in the run-up to the recent presidential election, there were signs that organizations such as the Cato Institute and Heritage Foundation were under pressure from donors to sacrifice long-held intellectual principles and instead become partisan cheerleaders. And I think that hopefully donors will realize that maybe the bigger rewards lie in winning an honestly fought long-term battle of ideas than undermining the reputations of institutions that had achieved a significant standing in the public square here in America. Yet even on policy matters where philanthrocapitalists tend to broadly agree, issues like entrepreneurship and particularly on education, there is growing political controversy about their role. Reforming America's failing public education system, especially through the spread of well-run charter schools, is a cause that's attracted funds from philanthrocapitalists from across the political spectrum. Yet these efforts have come under increasing attack. In her book, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, Diane Ravitch devotes a chapter to this branch of philanthrocapitalism, which she calls the Billionaire Boys Club. In this, she argues that there is, quote, something fundamentally anti-democratic about relinquishing control of the public education policy agenda to private foundations run by society's wealthiest people, who she describes as, quotes, bastions of unaccountable power. As the Walton Foundation is a big donor to charter schools, she sees common purpose in the anti-union policies of their family firm, Walmart, and their philanthropy's ideological commitment to the principle of consumer choice and to an unfettered market in education. I think as she does this, she confuses, critically, private management of schools, which is what charter schools are all about, with privatization and deregulation and a freedom from any government oversight, which I think they're most definitely not. I believe that, though it's far from perfect, the charter school movement is having a clear positive impact on America's education system, and its best practices need to be scaled up as fast as possible. I also think that efforts by the likes of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Broad Foundation have helped make a success of the Obama administration's Race to the Top program and helped move some 46 states to agree a common core curriculum at last, which I think will be the basis of some fairly dramatic improvement in education across the country, particularly by encouraging technology-based companies to invest a lot more in original content, which can be used widely. But what of Ravitch's concerns about unaccountable power? As I said earlier, the hyper-agency of the rich, even of Bill Gates, is limited. Unless the rich can persuade many others to go along with them, they're highly unlikely to achieve fundamental change. To my mind, the model that we now have for solving big problems in our society is no longer the siloed approach of government solves things, maybe the charitable sector fills in the gaps and the private sector generates the wealth. It's a much more ad hoc, less siloed partnership approach. Michael Green and I came up with a phrase that we thought best captured it, which is the posse, which you see in the Westerns, where a problem arises and someone rounds up a group of likely suspects who have the right skills to go out and ride out together and deal with whatever has to be done. Another term I've heard used for this is coalitions of the positive. Now, in my view, the formation of those posses or coalitions of the positive is what makes solutions possible, and that very process actually brings the democratic accountability that means we shouldn't be too worried about the fact that some of the people at the heart of those partnerships or posses are extremely wealthy. This doesn't make them plutocrats. It might make them sheriffs. That said, I believe more needs to be done to put to rest any fears we ordinary folk may have about becoming subjects of a plutocracy. Far greater transparency is required from our philanthrocapitalists, including about what they give to and about their failures. The giving pledge is but a start. Compared to business, I find as a reporter, the world of giving is very opaque, and what information is forthcoming tends to arrive far, far too late. There seems to be no reason why it should lag the business world this much, particularly now we have modern technology available to us. And one of the things that I would challenge philanthropists to do is to lead the way by actually voluntarily embracing transparency, in the understanding that this will make it much easier in the long run for them to go about their business, because it will reduce the sort of suspicion that the likes of Diane Ravitch are likely to stir up at every opportunity. I'd also like there to be a proper debate about the tax deductibility of charitable donations and whether these really benefit society, at least in the form in which they now operate. And maybe we will have one next year. In a recent article for The Economist, I describe evidence that calls into question the social value of much charity, and I argue for a public benefit test to be applied to qualify for a deduction. I'm also struck by the fact that many of the philanthrocapitalists actually dispute whether the tax deduction really has any impact on them at all, and in some cases it seems to be a bit of a constraint. The Omidyar network, to which I referred, set up a standard foundation initially, but found that so constraining that they moved away from it and created this new organisation which allows them to very easily decide whether to make a traditional grant or maybe even make a for-profit investment within the same structure. And they like to talk about how they've been set free from the tax code. Perhaps the Manhattan Institute should itself lead a debate about what should be the social contract or compact between the rich and the rest of us, so that we can actually calm the fears of ordinary people whilst giving philanthropists the freedom to work their magic. Is it really magic? Well, I think the results are going to be crucial, and I've dated this movement really back to 1997 and Ted Turner's speech. So we've had 15 years of rapid growth, of rapid experimentation, and I think now is the start of the period where we're going to start to see exactly what has this delivered. You know, the charter movement, charter school movement is one sign of progress. The next 5 years will be very crucial for that. The Gates effort on malaria, which has already, it seems, maybe reduced infant deaths by maybe 500,000, by about 50% in 5 years, is another sign that a new approach to global public health, using the posse structure that I talked about, can also work. But I think one of the things that's going to be decisive in whether the public embraces philanthrocapitalism and supports it, or whether it turns against it and sees it more evidence of the rich being feckless and useless, is going to be the fruits of their labours, and does this stuff really work? And that's also going to be a huge influence on whether those other billionaires, or indeed anyone else with any money or wish to be involved in philanthropy, including any of us here, wants to get involved. If we can see it working, then we want to be part of it. If it doesn't work, then maybe we don't. I have to say that I think that if we have that debate, and if we figure out the right social contract, I believe that including our greatest entrepreneurs in solving the biggest problems that we face makes a lot of sense, and I'm optimistic that we can solve some of those big problems much more quickly than the current gloom suggests that we will. And I'd like to end on that optimistic and upbeat note, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. We have some time for questions. I'll take the prerogative of the first. You mentioned both Peter Thiel and Bill Gates, and it strikes me that they're quite different examples. And Peter Thiel may be looking for his leverage, and you use that term, through the leverage of cultural influence, right? By saying, maybe you don't need to go to college. Now, it's quite different from an elaborate program working with government to minimize dropout and complete four-year graduation. Does Gates sacrifice some of the potential for contrarianism and flexibility that Thiel has through the focus on leverage and possidom, to use your term?
Well, I think, Peter Thiel is, he's doing a lot of different things. I mean, some of what he's doing is investing in very blue sky investments that, for example, on reversing biological aging, which, is not about culture change, but really about the most blue sky science you can imagine. And Gates, I think is doing some things that are also quite lean and nimble, although many of the things that his foundation are doing, one looks at the outside and it looks quite bureaucratic. But I think one of the things I like about capitalism is how much variety there is, and you don't in fact, there's lots of different approaches, and you see which ones pay off. And there is there is a lot of opportunity to try things, risks that get taken. Many risks prove to have been bad risks. And I still think that even the size of Gates is still small enough that its behavior, if it gets things wrong, then it leaves plenty of opportunities for others to move into the space which it's failed to address. And so there's enough to keep it on its toes. But I think he has created a big bureaucracy.
He has.
And maybe that's necessary for the scale of the problems that he's dealing with, but I think there are others that will try and attack those problems from different ways. And I mean, he is supporting something like Intellectual Ventures, Nathan Myhrvold's company, which is doing things like trying to redesign the mosquito, but programs to actually sort of eliminate the sort of mosquitoes that carry the malaria germ, or to actually design laser beams that actually wipe out the mosquitoes that carry malaria, which are very high-tech solutions in principle, but actually seem to be using bits of technology that are available in mobile phones and rather cheap products. So it's not all that big kind of aid bureaucracy type stuff that we maybe see as the most visible face of the Gates Foundation.
So not ossified. Okay. Questions? Jim.
Thank you, Matthew, very much. Some of the early philanthropists in American life in the late 19th century built institutions, a lot of them universities, Rockefeller University, Vanderbilt, Duke, Stanford, Chicago, Rice, you could go on. And as they moved into these other fields like education and medical research, eventually government took them all over. You mentioned Gates's comment. Gates does a lot of work in medical research, about $3 billion a year where they spend. But the budget of the National Institutes for Health is around $50 billion. So it's a drop in the bucket there and a drop in the bucket. So I guess my question is, their government is taking over all of these areas, and they're now increasingly fighting against what government has done and trying to reform these systems. Might they be better off, instead of doing that, maybe just taking their funds that they've earned through business and reinvesting it to create new businesses and jobs and innovations in the private sector and drive our society forward in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they don't see it as an either or. I think what you typically are hearing, and I think what lies behind this interest in impact investing, is this notion that they are looking for opportunities to invest more of their money in areas where there's an explicit sense that if you get it right, you can have a much bigger social benefit than if you maybe just sort of spread your money broadly across the spectrum. So, Richard Branson is investing a lot in trying to in companies that try and develop fuel that doesn't produce a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, because he is betting that A, he thinks there's climate change, and B, that even if there isn't, that there's going to be a very high price imposed on climate, which will shut down his the business of flying if they're not very careful. And so he is saying, well, if we get that right, there's a big social benefit in that we'll be able to liberate flying and make it much more available. Likewise, the Omidyar network that I talked about, I mean, they're investing in now trying to sort of develop a medical devices market in India. And so they're simultaneously, they've said that's an area that if it succeeds would have a very high benefit. They're not only investing in companies that are catering to that market, but they're also trying to create an Indian version of the FDA, which is more suited to India, because they've noticed that actually many developing countries are having to achieve regulatory approval at the FDA level, which is onerous and probably too intrusive and not appropriate to their own local markets. So there's a much more conscious notion that, yes, capitalism most forms of capitalism generate a social benefit, but actually some areas, if you can really crack a particular problem, have a huge win for society, whereas other bits maybe don't. And so if you can disproportionately focus on the bits that have that potential upside, because you're a philanthropist who can afford to lose all the money, and it may be riskier, but you're willing to bear that risk because the return is higher. So it's sort of for-profit philanthropy in a roundabout way.
Picking up on Jim's point, I would think it is kind of either or, because government is hugely inefficient, business is efficient. Charity, it seems, is in the middle, because if Gates had a division that was losing money or an individual that wasn't doing well, he'd fire him. It's tough in the nonprofit. You don't want to fire Susan, who you like, even though she's not the best. It's less efficient. And if I'm going to confront these, like, I love what Forbes has done in the last Forbes 400 issue, where it's about what are you doing for charity. But a lot of these guys have a proven record of creating all this wealth as being capitalists, employing all these people who then create other wealth. And as philanthropists, they may be lousy.
They may be lousy. I mean, I think, it's their money. I mean, the alternative might be that they would just spend it on champagne and yachts, and, you know, that may be as beneficial to society as what...
in their business.
Yeah, but I mean, they may not reinvest in the business. They might just sort of spend it on champagne and yachts. But they, fundamentally, Gates, Microsoft does not lack for funds. So I don't think Gates really felt that he needed to keep reinvesting in Microsoft. He also felt that he had probably exhausted his usefulness to the company, that he had reached a point in his life where he's ready to take on a new challenge. And so this was what he felt was his new challenge. And, I don't think anyone can accuse him of going about it with anything less than 100% rigor. Now, whether he's got the right skill set to succeed in generating, helping people generate solutions to massive diseases is what we're going to find out over the next few years. But it doesn't seem to me, you look at some of the things that when he actually did try and invest in some alternative industries. I mean, he's a big investor in the Four Seasons Hotel Group, which has not been a huge success, nor necessarily had a huge benefit to society. He's didn't really spot the internet. I don't know. I mean, maybe he'd exhausted his usefulness in business and was ready to become something else. So I don't know. I think that he certainly would be the last person that would get up and say there was anything wrong fundamentally with capitalism. I mean, he would say, at the margins, that capitalism should be more overtly addressing the needs of the poor. And his analysis is that the reason it doesn't do so is because the poor don't have any money. And that he can put his money in the hands of the poor. Now, you then ask a question, which is, is he accurately reflecting what the poor would spend the money on, and shouldn't he just write them all checks? And I think, I think he's trying to do that, but I mean, whether he's doing that in the most effective way, we will find out. But you are seeing a lot of work going into how do you empower the poor with mobile phone banking systems, maybe give them money to give them access to finance, loans, and all that sort of thing, which is about building capitalist systems in the developing world, which I think is an issue that many philanthrocapitalists of all political colours seem to be engaged in, which seems to me far better than the traditional aid model of government-to-government aid and so forth. So, but I just think that argument that they should just stick to investing is, undercomplicates things. I mean, it's a much more of a personal thing. He's much more fulfilled doing what he's doing now, which presumably means you get much more performance out of him than he was when he was running Microsoft in the last few years.
Yes, I'm Michael Myers of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. I am wondering if you have not understated and underplayed the role of the philanthropist with respect to being intrusive of the charity advocacies and overriding the interest of the charitable advocacies. The examples, one you mentioned, Cato, and the other example is Bloomberg, whose deputies called up all the charities which he supported in order to get them to support a change in the term limits law. And on the other side of that coin, I'm wondering if there is not an argument to be made on behalf of anonymous contributions. Why should anybody in the public have to know that Cato is supported by the Koch brothers, or that the Manhattan Institute is supported by this group? Why? Isn't there an argument on behalf of anonymity of contributions and for charities, advocacy charities?
Well, I think that the nature of our economic system at the moment, and likely to remain the nature of the system for the next few years, is that people who have great entrepreneurial skills are going to get extremely rich if they execute, if they get the right idea and they execute on it. And so inequality is going to rise. There's nothing that I can see that is going to reduce that, and I don't see government being able to significantly get in the way of that, given the kind of global system that we operate in at the moment, except in extremely disruptive kind of backlash type of ways that so far we haven't seen in either Europe or America, but that I think one can see the early seeds of that. If we had another 20 years or 10 years of what we've had in the last 5 years, I think you do start to seriously eat away. And the last 5 years is actually a continuation maybe of a 15-year period of where the average family in America hasn't seen its real income in the marketplace rise. The whole system does start to come into question. And so I think transparency is one part of the system that we need to know if these wealthy people are behaving in a way that we feel comfortable about as a society, or are they undermining our freedoms? And it seems to me, at the very least, that that is necessary for the sort of trust that holds a society together. And in America, historically, there's always been a great acceptance of inequality because everyone believes they can be rich too. And I think that's what's distinguished America from Europe in many ways. But that could be undermined if you start to see a ruling class emerge that uses its wealth to put up walls. This is what you saw in Mexico and Latin America for many years, where the rich basically kept out everyone else. It's what you saw in much of continental Europe. So I think that there needs to be some rules of the game here, and I think one of the rules of the game is that there needs to be much more transparency about what the successful are up to, and another is that they do play an active role in giving back. I mean, this is what Andrew Carnegie argued for in his Gospel of Wealth, that if capitalism was to survive, the successful capitalists had to reinvest in society to make sure the socialists were kept at bay. And I'm very struck, actually. One of the things that worries me is that if you talk to most of the American, if you read the billionaire letters in the Giving Pledge, they've all posted letters. I think 2 of them mention inequality. Most of them talk about how grateful they are for the opportunity they've been given by America and how happy it is to give back. It makes them feel. So it's all about a feel-good philanthropy rather than a fear-based philanthropy, which I think Carnegie had partly in what he was doing. And I don't want people to be terrified, but I do think an understanding of the risks that if you have wealth increasingly concentrated without any transparency about what happens to it, I think that you are sowing the seeds of instability much later on.
Please join me in thanking Matthew Bishop.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.